We publish various journals, one of which is the Daily Israelnet Briefing, which is a daily email magazine that goes out all over the world, currently read by about 50,000 people. And if that interests you, we're happy to send it to you. Just give Yuna, our secretary, your email, and you'll receive it gratis. It's a free publication. We have other publications. We have a quarterly journal called Isra Facts. We work very closely with students on and off campus. We mount various seminars and colloquia. One of them is our Israel Learning Seminar, pointed primarily at students dealing with BDS issues on campus. We just had our major gala. Every year we have a major gala here in Montreal. We have a second one in Toronto, where we have a second office and chapter. And the gala this year was devoted to Israel's contributions, biblical and modern, to Western civilization. This was Sunday night. We had a very large group at that, and we had Rabbi Cooper from the Wiesenthal Center speaking, and Ambassador Yoram Edinger from Israel, one of the leading experts on contemporary Israel society. So that is what we do. The offices here are open to those interested in the issues that we deal with. The library is an excellent working library. We have other research tools here, and we invite you to come and make use of this facility, particularly if you're students. And I'm very glad to see here today a number of my students and my colleagues from Concordia and a few other universities. And I guess it helps to have a major figure from Concordia speaking to us with his own following, who have clearly come here today. I'll say a few words about God Saad for you to situate his talk. He is the professor of marketing, a professor of marketing at Concordia, and the holder of the university's research chair in evolutionary behavioral sciences and Darwinian consumption. He has received the university's Commerce faculty's Distinguished Teaching Award. He's been the recipient of the President's Media Outreach Award, and many other scholarly and pedagogical honors. He's written several books and a whole raft of articles, some 75 plus at current count, usually turning on the use of evolutionary psychology in marketing and consumer behavior. He runs a Psychology Today blog called Homo Consumericus, and he has his own YouTube channel, very much watched, a very large audience, called The Saad Truth. And that YouTube and the blog have engendered 4.3 million and 5.2 million total views, respectively. So he is a well-known academic figure, respected academic figure, a fine teacher, and also a media personality of wide repute. He received his BA, his Bachelor of Science, and his MBA from McGill University, and his MS and PhD from my own alma mater, Cornell University. His talk today is called Ostrich Parasitic Syndrome, Terminal Disease of the Human Mind. And I'm going to let him explain that very cryptic title to you in some detail. He's going to speak for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers, comments. So we were delighted to have you here, and I hope this is the beginning of a much more continuous relationship between CIJR and God Saad. God, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fred, for the lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming out. I remember from the only time I think that I've been here, or maybe I've been one or two times here, I remember that the venue is very intimate, and my recollection is correct indeed. It's a very, very tight but warm venue. As Fred mentioned, I'll explain to you. For short, instead of repeating every time Ostrich Parasitic Syndrome, I might just say OPS. And you'll see what I mean in a second. Let's get going. So there are two Two of the greatest threats that have faced humanity come in one of two varieties. There are biological pathogens, either viruses, parasites, bacteria that have killed millions and millions of people. I won't list them all here. But if you, for example, have an innate fear of sharks, I would say that that's not the most adaptive fear. You should be afraid of mosquitoes because they kill a lot more people than do great white sharks. And so we have biological pathogens that have killed a lot of people, but there's another group of pathogens, metaphorically speaking, that are also very problematic. And those are viruses of the human mind. So ideas, beliefs, attitudes, and mindsets that parasitize one's ability to think properly via the use of reason, logic, and science. And I'll explain very specifically what I mean by OPS. Maybe arguably now the most dangerous of all mind viruses that we face. Just to draw an analogy, since I'm an evolutionary behavioral scientist, I oftentimes look for analogies in other animals to study the human animal. Let me just briefly mention some parasitic or pathogenic manifestations in the animal kingdom. So in this first case here, you have the spider wasp. The spider wasp will sting a spider that's much bigger than it, rendering that spider completely zombified, and then that carries the spider to its burrow, and then it lays its eggs, and then the offsprings will eat the spider in vivo. I actually argue that political correctness is a wonderful analogy to this situation. Here we have the P. tenuis brainworm. So when this particular brainworm infects various ungulates, it turns them oftentimes into complete zombies. So for example, you'll have what's called circling. So if this brainworm reaches the brain of this animal, it will just aimlessly go around in circles until typically it dies of exhaustion, it dies of starvation, or some looming predator gets to it. And then here we have Toxoplasma gondii. This is where it infects this mouse, which once it is infected with this parasite, the mouse loses its innate and very adaptive fear of the cat. So there are all sorts of cases in nature where a brain parasite will result in rather suboptimal and maladaptive behaviors. And of course, what I will argue is that OPS is very much a manifestation of that when we think about some of the geopolitical realities that we're facing today. Just to again give you another example of the dangers of faulty cognition and perception, this is a woman who suffers from anorexia nervosa. Typically, most of these types of eating disorders, they're almost exclusively female-based, in the order of 90% plus. And there are some very interesting evolutionary and biological reasons why that would be the case. Well, when this woman is actually looking at herself in the mirror, she genuinely believes herself to be grotesquely overweight. Right? So there's something that's going on where there is a breakdown in her ability to perceive reality in the appropriate way, rendering her susceptible to slowly, dying a very, very painful death. Which leads us, so to kind of, now that I've given you a background, forgive me, it's a bit long, but this is the definition that I originally offered for OPS, and I've provided for you here the actual episode on my channel if you decide to go and look at it then. So let me just read this for you. So what is OPS? This disorder causes a person to reject realities that are otherwise as clear as the existence of gravity. Sufferers of OPS do not believe their lying eyes. They construct an alternate reality known as unicornia. In such a world, science, reason, rules of causality, evidentiary thresholds, a near infinite amount of data analytic procedures, inferential statistics, the epistemological rules inherent to the scientific method, rules of logic, historical patterns, daily patterns, and common sense are all rejected. Instead, the delusional ramblings of an OPS sufferer are rooted in illusory correlations, non-existent causal links, and feel-good progressive platitudes. Ostrich logic is always delivered via an air of haughty moral superiority. Two telltale signs of comorbidity include a nasty form of the Dunning-Kruger effect, arrogant and self-assured about one's idiocy, and introspective blindness, inability to ever know that you are afflicted with OPS. These comorbid factors, when coupled with OPS, render meaningful dialogue impossible. Let me give you some classic manifestations of OPS. This is OPS. This is OPS. Western feminists, this is liberatory because it averts the rape gaze of males. This is patriarchal oppression. That's OPS. This was actually yesterday, and I went after her. I can't take all the credit for having her taken down her tweet, but I'd like to take some of the credit because my last Sad Truth episode was actually critiquing this tweet, which you will no longer find because of the backlash. You have it too.
What's the tweet say?
Our strength is in our differences. Our power is in our diversity. We are so beautiful, all of us, when we see each other. Except that this woman can't see anything, nor can we see her. Other than that little twist of irony, we're good, and we see ourselves and so on. So I went after her, and eventually, many people went after her. She took it down.
What did you say to her?
I didn't say to her specifically. I tweeted to her, but I put out a Sad Truth clip where I analyzed the stupidity. This is actually from another one of my Sad Truth clips. These are a bunch of IDF soldiers praying at the wall. There's a doctoral student, an Israeli woman, a Jewish woman, at Hebrew University, who produced a paper while she was a doctoral candidate a few years ago, where she was looking to identify the rampant cases of rape of Palestinian women, the innocent, honorable Palestinian women, by the grotesque, evil Jews. When she found out that there wasn't a single reported case of rape, not a single one, what she concluded was that what more evil and diabolical, manifestation could you have than these IDF soldiers who so dehumanize Palestinian women that they're not even good enough to rape them. So to rape women is a manifestation of how evil the Israelis are.
Prize too.
And got a prize. And to not rape women is also a man. So all roads lead to the evil Jews. This is another example of OPS. This is a personal example. This is a clip, New Trends in Arabic Anti-Semitism. You'll see a montage of about 20 plus minutes of some of the very beautiful tolerance and peace that these lovely dispensers of peace think about the Jews. A Jewish friend of mine had asked me, what does Islam preach about the Jews? Since you, Gad, Saad, seem to know a lot about this, you obviously grew up. By the way, if you don't know my personal history, we are Lebanese Jews who escaped Lebanon at the start of the Lebanese Civil War under imminent threat of execution. My parents returned to Lebanon in 1980 when they were kidnapped by Fatah. But in any case, so I have a personal history, let alone academic knowledge of the matter. So I decided to simply share with her this clip. So rather than get into a whole bunch of discussions of how to interpret a particular text and so on, I said, why don't you start off by watching this clip, and hopefully this answers your question. Her rebuttal was, this is a Jewish woman, was that I was no different in my extremism than these people. So she wasn't able to see, based on her moral compass, that somebody who shares a clip about genocidal hate is different than the ones who are espousing genocidal hate. We were both equally extremist in our positions. That's OPS. I won't go through these because I only have 45 minutes, but I would implore you to watch these two exchanges. One is Congressman Dan Lundgren questioning Assistant Defense Secretary for Homeland Defense Paul Stockton. This is in the previous administration. and Congressman Lamar Smith questioning former Attorney General Eric Holder. These are congressional hearings where they're trying to get them to admit that is it possible that the terror attacks that we're seeing and the global mayhem could in any way be somehow linked to the religion of peace, somehow. And you just have to watch the interaction to truly see what OPS does to a brain of a person. Here are some other OPS sufferers. I'll be speaking this Friday on my show with advisor to this gentleman this Friday, so try to tune in if you can. Of course, this is David Cameron, the former Prime Minister. Okay. This guy has truly beautiful hair.
Sorry. Just the links to the two videos you posted.
Yeah.
Are they going to be up on your website or?
I could put them up, or,
Okay,
or
sorry.
this clip is going to be eventually up, so you could probably see it.
Perfect. Thank you.
So remember that these guys always say, you know, the 30,000 plus attacks, none of them have anything to do with redacted, don't say it. So let's see here, I've listed here for you 67 countries. It would be a lot more impactful as a rhetorical device if I actually read these 67 countries for you, but given the limited time, I won't. So there are 67 countries that have been the recipients of tolerance and love, and here are some of the reasons that have been proposed. I won't read all of them, but they're fantastic. Violent video games. Lack of adequate exposure to art. This is not satire. This is not Saad satire. You could find the links to each of those arguments made by very serious people. It's just male bonding. It's workplace violence. This is Major Hassan. Okay? This is climate change. It's droughts. It's carbon emissions. Bill Nye. Our luminary man, Bill Nye, immediately after the last Paris attack, went on Huffington Post Live and said, well, it is completely conceivable to make an argument for, I'm paraphrasing his words, as to how the Paris attack that took place in Paris is very much linked to things like solar panels and carbon emissions and so on. Oh, no, I'm not. Okay? And we could go on and on and on. I won't go through all of them. Here's the latest manifestations. Riz Ahmed, who some of you may know is an actor, warns Parliament, this is from The Independent, right, that a lack of diversity in TV is leading people to ISIS. Usually the way it works in acting, you apply for a job, you don't get it, you run off to Raqqa to throw away the Shia dogs off the rooftop. It's a very direct link. It seems very, very possible. This is another one. This has me scratching my head because I too am unable to identify a motive. It turns out that the Westminster attacker acted alone, and the police says the motive may never be known. It's not satire.
We led our journal today with that headline.
Yeah.
It's called a mediocrity.
So I'm giving you now sort of to whet your appetite about OPS, but what I'll do next is I'll actually give you various instantiations of OPS and some of the rhetorical devices that OPS sufferers will typically use. So this was the first example, so OPS example 1, it doesn't matter how much data I provide you, it could never be linked to the ideology of peace. Here's another one. This is what I call the deflect, deflect, deflect. But bruh, what about the Crusades? What about the Old Testament? What about the 12 people who belong to an incestuous clan called the Westboro Baptist Church? I know I'm staying up all night, almost with our bags packing, because I'm so afraid of the Westboro Baptist Church coming after us. What about the 8 people, I think it's 8, Christian murderers at abortion clinics? Bruh, what about Timothy McVeigh? All religions and cultures are equal. Every faith has bad people. And of course, to criticize Islam is to demonize all Muslims. There are many other strategies of deflection. I'm just offering you a few. Of course, if I had more time, I would drill down on each of these and demonstrate how just profoundly idiotic they each are. 3, OPS 3 is what I call Unicorn Islam. These are leading imams of Unicorn Islam, include nearly all Western politicians, right? So for example, Unicorn Islam is where real Islam loves everyone, but they have a special affinity for Jews and gays. Some of the grand muftis of Unicorn Islam is this luminary, Reza Aslan and Judy Jasser. This is actually one of my followers who created this meme. This is based on a quote that I had. He took this quote of mine and he came up with this. So the mind of the religious apologist, ideology preaches very clearly X, Y, and Z, but not A, B, or C. Apologist abhors the former, but supports the latter. He builds a unicorn version of his or her religion wherein A, B, C are allowed and X, Y, Z are forbidden. I call this the unicorn bias, right? It's just endless, right? I've been involved in this engagement with endless people, thousands of people, and they always succumb to this type of bias, right? But no, this is a student of mine. She said to me, but no, my father taught us, they're Muslim, that we should love and respect Jews, and Jews are our brothers, right? Well, that's your personal experience, and it's wonderful that you grew up in a liberal, tolerant family where your father taught you that. That says nothing about whether the Islamic texts, the canonical Islamic texts, say that or not, right? And so you create a unicorn. So if you're, for example, a gay Islamic reformer, you create a version where if you truly knew real Islam, they love the gays. If you have Jewish friends and you're an Islamic reformer, well, if you really knew Islam, it's nothing but love for the Jews. And on and on and on, right? It's obfuscation, it's deception, it's baloney. Here's another example of OPS. I call this the holy 3M of apologia. Misinterpreted, misunderstood, mistranslated, right? So, hence the 3M of apologia, right? You don't understand. If you understood the meaning truly, then you would know that when it says kill, 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 it's metaphorical. It really means kill with caresses and massages, right? Typically, if you want to implement this holy 3M of apologia, you engage in what I call the infinite loop of delegitimization. And the way it works is that someone with whom you are interacting will pose you a bunch of questions to try to, at each step, delegitimize you as a authoritative source. And they will go as far as they need to go in the infinite loop of questioning until they get you with one. So for example, do you speak Arabic? Well, most people are going to fail in that one. I don't. Arabic is my mother tongue. So if you say yes, do you know how to read classical Arabic? Let's suppose you say yes. Well, are you a Muslim? Yes. Are you a Hafiz? Hafiz in Arabic, Hafiz is to memorize, so a Hafiz is someone who has memorized the Quran, who could recite it fully by memory. Are you a theologian, and more specifically an Islamic cleric? Yes. Were you trained at Al-Azhar University? Yes. Now he's running out of questions. Are you one of Muhammad's original faithful companions? God damn it, no, because I was born in 1964. Well, then shut your mouth. Then you can't really speak. You weren't there. So in other words, even for someone who passes n-1 of these questions, I could get you at the nth question to delegitimize you. Okay? Now remember, here, one of the questions that I'm trying to demonstrate that you're not an authority is, are you an Islamic theologian? Were you trained at Al-Azhar? If you say no, then how could you speak about this? Now watch the incredible irony. OPS example number 5. But he's no true Muslim, bruh. Now that one is based on the no true Scotsman fallacy, which is a real cognitive fallacy, right? Where whatever you say that this particular individual is representative of group X, then you simply say that that individual could not be a true representation of the archetype of group X, right? I've actually had these conversations where I use each of the following. So it turns out that Grand Mufti Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem prior to modern day Israel, Sheikh Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, of course the leader of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who is arguably today the most famous and influential Sunni cleric, and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the current caliph of ISIS, who holds a PhD in Islamic theology. When I quote things from them, it turns out that they're not true Muslims. They're fake Muslims. They're not the real deal. But the one who is true is your friend Ahmad, who drinks alcohol and eats pork. He's the true embodiment of Islam. Now again, this is because people are much more compelled to believe in personal anecdotes, right? Most of us, I could certainly speak for myself having grown up in Lebanon, I've met endless number of people of the Muslim faith, and all of them, most of them, other than the ones who were running away from in Lebanon, have been perfectly lovely and kind. So it's very easy for me to use that information in shaping my impression of the archetype of the Muslim. They're very nice. They've all been very nice. I've had endless students. They've all been lovely. I've had colleagues. They've all been lovely. But that's not how you judge whether the doctrines of a religion are consistent with some of our secular liberal values or not. Here's another one. But what about Andalusia? Right? The argument there basically is you identify a time period where technically there was a peaceful period. And there is no better manifestation of that than the golden age of Spain, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims walked around holding hands and singing Kumbaya and singing John Lennon Imagine, which is not exactly how it was during Andalusia, but that's the reality that we've constructed. Well, if Islam is a violent, intolerant religion, how do you then explain that there was peace then? If Islam is a violent religion, how do you explain that you lived in Lebanon until you had to leave because they were going to behead you? But let's forget about that part, right? Well, this here I use, again, logical reasoning is a very, very powerful rhetorical device to use, because you basically take the structure of an argument and you analogize it, and it becomes very difficult for people to argue against you. So I've used this example. Our good man here, Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most famous serial killers of all time, who killed 17 people in very grotesque ways. If you calculate the number of days in his life as an adult that he's killed people, it turns out that 99.72% of all days he was perfectly peaceful, loving, and kind, didn't murder anybody. It's only in 0.28% of the days that he killed people. So when you take the totality of Jeffrey Dahmer, he's a lovely, sweet, kind fellow. Guess what? When I offer these rhetorical bombs, they usually run away. Because it's very difficult when you use these types of analogies, because you take the exact structure of the argument and you satirize it using very powerful analogies. This is the hashtag, not all Muslims, right? And Lawrence Krauss, who is a physicist, famously wrote an article where he said, he was talking about the likelihood of you dying of a terror attack, and compared it to all sorts of things. Well, you're much more likely to die of stomach cancer, you're much more likely to die of this and that, so don't worry about it. Go about living your merry life. So I took this opportunity to analogize this. So here we've got a dark alley. Yes? Now, in 2014, the murder rate in Canada was 1.45 people per 100,000. That's a very, very, very small probability. That's of all murders. Now, the number of murders in dark alleys, by definition, probabilistically, is a much smaller number than that. It is much less than 1.45 per 100,000. Therefore, you shouldn't be afraid to walk down a dark alley. This is why it's very important to have the hashtag not all dark alleys, hashtag stop dark alley phobia, because you're marginalizing dark alleys when you are doing this. In most cases, it's perfectly safe to walk down dark alleys. Only the naturally lobotomized could argue these things. But once you're trained in cognitive psychology and psychology of decision making, once you have a functioning brain, then you realize how erroneous this type of thinking is. OPS example number 8. This is called the Ostrich permutation game. By the way, if you're thinking, why do I come up with these terms? Actually, again, it's for rhetorical reasons. When you name something and it becomes mimetic, when it becomes viral, I could now go on the internet and do a search, and there are 10 million people that are using these terms. I don't do it because I'm being narcissistic. I'd like to see my meme spread. It's because that becomes a powerful way to describe a phenomenon. So that's why I take the time to come up with these terms. Okay. So it turns out that what we're fighting, if you take the following 3 words, militant, violent, and extremist, well, my undergrad was in mathematics and computer science, so luckily I could calculate these permutations. If you've got 3 words and you want to come up with 2 permutations, it ends up that the number is 6, so you could fight against violent extremism, or violent militantism, or militant violence, or militant extremism, or you could fight something completely different, which is extremist militantism, or the very different beast, which is extremist violence. Now, if you add a few additional words and you could watch, so for example, we could have radicalized, homegrown, fundamentalist, extremist, violent, militant zealotry resulting in man-made disasters. So come up with an infinite well of euphemisms as long as you don't say what we're fighting. So remember, don't name the problem, for otherwise it will marginalize and subsequently radicalize all the modern folks. So if all of these things, by the way, there are other manifestations of OPS that I haven't mentioned here. For those of you that want to see some of those, go to my writings and to my YouTube channel. You'll see many other examples that I offer. I try to keep this to adhere to Fred's 40 minutes or so limit. So how do we fight them? Well, first of all, knowing these rhetorical strategies and how to combat them is one way to fight them. But what I'm going to argue next is actually something that I've been pushing in my scientific work. Before I explain all this, let me give you the background to what a nomological network is. In evolutionary science, a nomological network is a network of cumulative evidence that I build when I am making an evolutionary argument. So for example, if I want to argue that men have an evolved preference for women that exhibit the hourglass figure, right? And why would that be an evolved preference? Well, I could collect data that's medical data, epidemiological data, cross-cultural data, psychological data, neuroimaging data, data from men who have never had the gift of sight, who will prefer such women by simply touching different mannequins. I could collect data from many, many different sources, all of which point to the unassailable explanation that I'm trying to support. That's called a nomological network. So I take this epistemology and I apply it to what we're talking about today. So for example, if I want to know, is religion X peaceful? I could say, well, what is the broad range of data that I could collect to help me determine whether, yes, it is indeed peaceful, or perhaps it's not. And so here, this is called a nomological network. Let me just sort of walk through some of these. Each of these boxes is a small puzzle of the broad nomological network. When taken in its totality, it becomes very difficult. It becomes incontrovertible evidence. It becomes unassailable evidence for whatever position you're holding. By the way, Charles Darwin himself, when he wrote Origin of Species, for any of you who know this work, he really was building a nomological network. He didn't call it that, but what did he do? He collected data from many, many different sources, all of which, when put together, made it unassailable that his theory of natural selection had to be correct. That's what he was doing. He didn't collect one data source. He didn't collect one study. It's the totality of data from many different sources that made his argument so powerful. So let's do this for our current purposes here. So I could take, for example, contemporary FBI data. I could do an analysis of FBI terrorist list to gauge whether a particular religion has a greater likelihood of contributing to that list. So there is such a list. There is a list of the top 35 or 40, I don't remember the exact number, who are those 40 people. And I could look, for example, whether Latvians are more likely to be there, whether people from Vietnam are more likely. Is it the Haitians who are more likely? Is it Hasidic Jews who live in Outremont that are likely to be on that list? We could answer that question. We don't have to guess. That data exists. We could do a similar analysis for governmental no-fly lists. So there is a list, I think, of 65,000 names that are on a no-fly list. We could look to see whether there is any common thread that runs across these people. If this type of data doesn't, nail it for you, well, we could look at a database of terror attacks. The University of Maryland has a global terror database, and we could look to see whether there's any particular group. Maybe it's communists, maybe it's eco-warriors. Let's see who is likely to be on that terrorism database. The Religion of Peace has a list, and it's a conservative list, by the way. You should go and check it out. Over 30,000 documented terror attacks since 9/11 alone. The 67 countries that I listed earlier were from that website. If you want something even quicker, you could just go to Wikipedia. Wikipedia keeps account every year of the main ones. And you could see if there's any common thread that runs there. You could look at global surveys. For example, the Pew surveys, which are nonpartisan, very reputable. Pew surveys, they track people's attitudes and behaviors toward foundational values of secular and liberal society. So for example, since we're here in this particular venue, I could go and look to see whether there are particular countries that hold grotesque views of the Jews. And if I find that the survey, these Pew surveys are showing that 97, 98, 99% of a small minority. See, I don't know, maybe I forgot my stats, but it seems to me that 99% of a group is maybe not a small minority. So if 99% of a group is holding genocidal hatred towards the Jews, maybe that's something to talk about. There's global patterns of Jew hatred that we could look at, for example, the Anti-Defamation League reports. Let's keep going. We could look at historical data. So we could look at the analysis of the number of people that have been killed by adherents of religion X and the name of X since its founding. That data exists. If you're a historian, you have access to that data. You can get a sense of when Group A conquered region X, how many people died during it. How many people have been killed by fascism, by Nazism, by Judaism, by Islam, by Jainism. We could get that data. We don't have to engage in silly platitudes. That data exists. We could use the scientific method to navigate through this issue. We could look at the plight of religious minorities. So for example, we could look at longitudinal analysis of how well religious minorities fare in countries where X is the majority religion. That data exists. It's about as clear as the existence of gravity. You can go and check it out. It exists. You could apply the tools of science to navigate through this question. Let's finish our nomological network. I'll come to this one last. We could look at governmental lists of terror groups. For example, Public Safety Canada's list of terror organizations, the US Department of State's foreign terror organization list. We could see, and there are many others, where we could see whether there's any particular ideology that's overrepresented. We could look at data from global indices. So how do X-majority countries score on a broad range of well-being, freedom, and equality metrics? Now, all of these data sources coming from completely different paradigms, from different methodologies, procedures, will each contribute to the puzzle. This one, ultimately, though, is the one that allows us to answer whether a particular text preaches love or hatred. For those of you who are social scientists, you probably have heard of the methodology of content analysis. Content analysis is the technique that allows me to quantify the content of texts, right? So if I want to know, for example, how has the portrayal of women changed in advertising in the last 50 years? Well, I could take advertisements in magazines from 1950, from 1970, from 2000, and I could do a content analysis of these stimuli to answer my question. So if you want to know whether some canonical text preaches brotherly love or hatred, you could use the tools of content analysis to answer this question. And as a matter of fact, there's a gentleman that probably is known to some of the folks in this room, Bill Warner, who used to be a former professor of physics, who after he retired as a professor of physics, has dedicated much of the last 10 plus years to the very serious and formal study of Islam, has exactly done that. He applies the tools of content analysis to study the content of anything you want. You want to study the Old Testament, you want to study specifically Deuteronomy, we can do that. You want to study the Hadith, we can do that. The Sirah, the biography of Muhammad, we can do that. The Quran, we can do that. And then we could have a very unbiased way to say how often is love preached towards the Jews versus how often hatred is preached towards the Jews. We don't have to engage again in ignorance, in platitudes. There is a quantifiable way to get around that. So by coming up with all of these different data sources, then we can have a sense whether we feel confident in our position that religion X is peaceful or not. Okay? So to sort of try to wrap it up, or to wrap it up. So how do we combat OPS? Well, number one, we recognize the existential threats posed by OPS and the forces that have led to its spread. I haven't spent much time discussing the second part, right? I've offered you a preview of some of the key manifestations of OPS, but what we haven't discussed here today is, well, what causes people to be infected in this manner? What are some forces that has caused the West to slowly inch, as I say, towards the abyss of infinite darkness? What is it that's causing people to not be able to think clearly, to engage in disordered thinking? And that's actually what I'm hoping to do in my next book. Number two, we can eradicate political correctness, for it has utterly stifled the ability for reasonable people to have meaningful engagements about important issues. Unless we eradicate political correctness, we will lose the battle. For those of you who think that this is a battle, a military battle, or a battle of how to stop the next ISIS terrorist from getting in, that's a very short-term view. You have to take a long-term view of the problem. This is exactly what I discussed, if any of you watched or listened to my chat with my good friend Sam Harris, where we talked about these issues. And one of the things that I made to him, that I tried to convey to him during our chat, is that if you look at a much broader view, 50 years, 100 years, 300 years, then the question becomes not whether letting in 50,000 Syrians, what is the probability that some of them are going to be ISIS members, but rather by letting in 50,000 people who, most of whom don't hold values that are necessarily congruent with your Western secular liberal values, that's the question you want to be asking, right? And then your level of alarm will change. Yes, very, very few people are hardened ISIS terrorists, but very, very many people don't hold the same views as you when it comes to Jews or gays or women's clitorises. Okay? So, number three, use reason and the scientific method to win the battle of ideas, right? One of the reasons why I've been fortunate, I mean, yes, I receive hate mail and death threats and so on, but compared to how open I am, I'm actually, I mean, knock on wood, I'm actually quite surprised that I don't receive more. Why? Because I don't engage in fiery. Anything that I say is ultimately something that I can hopefully support with data, with reason, with logic. And therefore people don't necessarily feel aggrieved by what I'm saying, because I can always back it up by some data source. I don't engage in fiery language. Of course not all Muslims are bad. Most are perfectly lovely. But does Islam contain things that are perfectly inconsistent with what we want here? Absolutely. Can I point to it and quote it and analyze it for you? Yes. Do I speak Arabic? Yes. It makes it more difficult to try to delegitimize me. Okay? And then finally, do not cede a single inch. M103, motion 103, can you hear me? Do not cede a single inch to any ideology that is antithetical to our secular liberal. And when I say liberal, I contrast this with faux liberal. Most of the people who call themselves liberal today are actually faux liberals and our modern values. Thank you very much.